The speakers today will be, after Mr. LaRouche, will be Anton Chaikin. Mark Kalney, unfortunately, is ill and will not be here. However, his speech will be read for him by Khushro Gandhi, especially if he's here. Oh, there he is. Good. Good timing. Mike Minicino, Jeff Steinberg, and Kathleen Klanetsky. One of the most, among them, perhaps one of the most formidable collection of people who have developed the ideas and the exposés and the information and the analysis which has driven terror into the hearts of our enemies, and I think you'll see why as a result of the presentations which they make to you today. So, without further ado, if Charles has Lynn's tape ready, I would like to begin with that.
Recently, there was a letter and accompanying document attacking me, issued by the Supreme Commander of the Southern Jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, one C. Fred Kleinknecht. The issue which the document addresses explicitly is my proposal to remove from its position on U.S. government property in Washington, D.C., the ugly statue of a traitor, a war criminal, a racist, and a satanic degenerate, General Albert Pike, who was one of the leading predecessors of Mr. Kleinknecht as Sovereign Supreme Commander of the Southern Jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Moreover, Mr. Pike, General Pike as he's sometimes called, is the author of a book called Morals and Dogma, which by many members of the Scottish Rite in the United States is considered a virtual Bible, or at least the anti-Bible of that section of Freemasonry. And that book, Morals and Dogma, is a book consistent with the satanic religious beliefs explicitly adopted and advocated by General Pike. General Pike, of course, was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. That is not disputable on the basis of the evidence in hand, though Mr. Kleinknecht proposes to dispute it. What I wish to do here at this moment is to identify the nature of the core or characteristic issue at stake between me and the fellow who has engaged me publicly for this debate, Sovereign Supreme Commander C. Fred Kleinknecht. As the letters of Albert Pike to Giuseppe Mazzini illustrate the point, Pike, like Mazzini, was a Satanist, and like Mazzini, was an instrument of a circle in London headed or associated prominently with Lord Palmerston, the author of Opium Wars Against China, among his other virtues. The object of Pike's endeavor, and that of Palmerston and also Mazzini, was to destroy the United States, a continuing commitment since our War of Independence to destroy the United States, this time by means of fomenting a division of the nation between one part of the nation controlled by the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite and other parts of the nation. This conspiracy of traitors, and they were all in the leadership, conscious traitors to the United States, that is, agents acting as agents of a Britain which used them in an effort called the Civil War or the Secession to destroy the United States by dismembering it and thus making the entire Western Hemisphere virtually a colony of the British Empire. So these people were not honest rebels, they were traitors. This party of Treason was born in the Tory British sympathizers of the period of the American War of Independence. And because of a treaty arrangement, these people who were traitors in effect to the United States then stayed behind in large part and formed what became the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry in its modern form within the United States. They were famous as the slave traders. They were famous as the partners of the British East India Company, i.e. Lord Palmerston's Britain, in running opium principally into China. The Lowell family, for example, which George Bundy is descended, was part of this gang of treasonously inclined opium traders. They were the Perkins Syndicate of Salem, Massachusetts, which a lot of the Massachusetts blue blood families, so-called, were derived their wealth from. And they were also part of the Russell Syndicate out of Russell and Company in Connecticut. The Russell and Company, which is the controlling interest from then, early in the 19th century, to the present day at Yale University, which gave us, of course, such things as George Bush. And these people were notorious in 1814 as having been part of the British agent Burr's conspiracy to destroy the United States. They were part of what was called the Hartford Convention of 1814, a conspiracy by traitors to the United States, and they were outright traitors, to destroy the United States. The failure of this treason in 1814 led to the new conspiracy to divide the United States into two parts by secession, one a southern group of states committed to slavery, and the other a northern group of states committed to abolition of slavery. Though the northerners, such as the Lowell family of George Bundy's ancestors, while objecting to slavery in Massachusetts, did not object to it in the South. In fact, they benefited greatly from the use of slave-produced cotton for the New England cotton mills, like Friedrich Engels, the scoundrel whose wealth was derived from the use of slave cotton in England. After the Civil War, with the execution of Lincoln by circles which were associated with the treasonous southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite, and with its B'nai B'rith offshoot, which was the racist, treasonous and racist section of American Judaism, a very small minority of American Judaism at the time, Lincoln was assassinated by these people and their friends, and a more agreeable president, at least from the standpoint of the traitor standpoint, Andrew Johnson became president. As a result of a number of developments leading into the election of such atrocities as Confederate sympathizers, Teddy Roosevelt, whose ideas were shaped by his uncle, a Confederate traitor, Bullock, and the Confederate president, that is the Confederate who became president, Woodrow Wilson, who, among other things, incidentally co-sponsored the founding or refounding of the Ku Klux Klan in 1915. This nation was gradually taken over by the same group of people, the same group of racist traitors who formed the Confederacy earlier. To this date, the internal history of the United States and the conflict in the United States position in the world as a ally of British imperialism and similar evil enterprises has been based on a takeover of more and more of the institutions of the United States by the circles associated with the leadership of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. These are the racists. These are the authors of the accomplices of those who set forth two world wars in this century. These are the people who committed all of the atrocities against the peoples of the Caribbean region of South and Central America from the United States. These are the people who have trampled upon our Constitution, who have trampled upon our economy by introducing things like the Federal Reserve System, and so forth. These are the actual enemies of the United States, not because of, although each is accountable in his own person for what he does, the essence of the matter is this association of people who are in the tradition of Palmerston, Pike, and Mazzini in leading institutions in the United States, those who are in the tradition of the drug runners of the Perkins Syndicate and Russell Company today. So therefore, I'm very happy that C. Fred Kleinknecht has chosen to attack me so frequently and so violently by name, and to seek to mobilize all Freemasonic officers and through lodges throughout the country in the general mobilization against me. Because this indicates that the Freemasons recognize that we, those Freemasons in particular, recognize that we have become a significant threat to their power, chiefly by our raising during my presidential campaign with, together with the Reverend Bevel, the issue of the Pike statue. Either, if the statue comes down, that of course injures the interest of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. No question about it. However, if the Scottish Rite, aided by its Anti-Defamation League agents, were to succeed in preventing our efforts to pull down the statue, this would result in a much greater damage to the Scottish Rite by the following means. Let me call your attention to a book which is fairly famous in military history, which contains an apt description of the foolish situation into which Mr. Kleinknecht has maneuvered himself recently. This book is by the great German strategist, military strategist, von Treason, and its title is Cannae, and it deals not only with the Battle of Cannae in which Hannibal defeated the Romans, but it deals with the principle of the theory of the flank in throughout military history, including an examination of the genius of one of America's greatest military figures, General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the hammer that beat the Confederacy military force into a pulp on the anvil provided by Sherman's collaborator, General Grant. At Cannae, to make short, the Roman forces, which outnumbered the Carthaginians and their allies, formed a compact mass to assault the Carthaginians. In point of fact, they over-concentrated what was, for that period of time, their firepower. The military genius, Hannibal, exploited this mistake of the Romans of concentrating their firepower to the fore by flanking them and reducing a superior military force, that is the Roman force, to a shattered remnant in a battle which remained decisive for a long period thereafter, although Hannibal himself was ultimately defeated for different reasons. What Kleinknecht and his associates have done is to commit the same kind of folly in the political domain that the Roman commanders committed leading to their defeat at the Battle of Cannae. That is, they concentrated their forces, including the ADL, and their stooges even within the civil rights movement, to defend the statue at all costs. In so doing, they over-concentrated their forces toward the front and invited an attack upon their flank. Let me explain it this following way. What they've done, instead of giving up the Pike statue, which they should have done from the standpoint of elementary military and analogous reasoning, is to stake everything on holding it. And that is one sure way in military circles to ensure one's own defeat, or the likelihood of one's own defeat. First, they put the ADL out there in front. They said, as they said explicitly, they were not going to come out and take me on publicly, but rather they were going to use their stooge, the Anti-Defamation League, which has always been a stooge of the treasonous section of the Scottish Rite in America. They were going to use the ADL to deal with this issue. Well, the ADL was in a pickle. Not only is Pike the founder and represents the spiritual essence of the Ku Klux Klan, both in its first and second incarnations, but the ADL itself, through the B'nai B'rith, was a co-founder of the original Ku Klux Klan, and the ADL in its own right was a participant in the second founding, or the second coming, of the Ku Klux Klan in 1915. There was a link between the two in the person of Simon Wolfe, who was a key intelligence operative for the B'nai B'rith, working with the assassins of Abraham Lincoln back during the 1860s, and the very same Simon Wolfe, who lived until the 1920s, who was instrumental in bringing about the founding of the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan with the sponsorship of Woodrow Wilson in 1915. So the ADL currently, which pretends to be anti-racist, although it is racist and has a racist philosophy, has been campaigning around the country using the disgust against the Ku Klux Klan as a basis for presenting itself, the ADL, as the major defender of American virtue against the Ku Klux Klan. Now, it was very foolish of the Scottish Rite to propose that this Anti-Defamation League, this ADL, which purportedly is attacking the Klan in every legislature in the country, should come out in Washington, D.C. and around the country in defense of the founder of the Klan, that racist, traitorous, satanic degenerate, General Albert Pike, or at least Pike's statue. So the ADL found itself in difficulty, and the ADL could not, therefore, politically carry out the job which the Scottish Rite headquarters had assigned to it. Thus, because of resolutions around the country, in city councils and so forth, demanding the pulling down of this statue, the Scottish Rite decided that it had to come out in its own name. One of the associated reasons for the sensitivity of the Scottish Rite at this time was the fact that last year, the Southern Baptist Convention entertained a motion to ban membership in the non-Christian satanic Scottish Rite from members of the Baptist congregations. The banning did not occur, however, a resolution was successfully passed which proposed an investigation of the matter, a series of hearings, so to speak, which may be pursuant to reconsidering a motion to ban the Scottish Rite. So the Scottish Rite is very sensitive, and since it has about an estimated 1 million of the members of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite are in the Baptist communion, thus there's a very grave threat to the power of the Scottish Rite, the backers of the drug pusher and scoundrel Oliver North of Iran-Contra notoriety. So my attack on the Scottish Rite's Pike at this time opened up a weak flank in the entirety of the treasonous cabal which it represents, the Confederate tradition which it represents. And therefore, we are now in a position to do the following. Klein, Knecht and Company have adopted the provably treasonous, satanic, degenerate Pike as their own. Not merely from the past as a matter of tradition, but they have adopted him as something which they have to defend today. They've defended his work, they defended his ideas, and thus they have identified themselves with those ideas which their own library identifies Pike as advocating. They've also identified themselves as defending or apologizing for the crimes which Pike committed while he was alive. And thus they have put the stain of treason, Pike's treason, the stain of Satanism, Pike's Satanism, and the stain of satanic degeneracy in general upon themselves as an organization until they shall repudiate it. In the meantime, the major campaign of the visible public campaign of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite since the 1940s has been to serve the cause of Satan exactly as General Pike advocated by attempting to destroy Christianity in the United States, while pretending to believe, of course, in the supreme being, just as Robespierre, the butcher of the French Revolution, professed his belief in the supreme being, and he was, of course, a Freemason, essentially of the same philosophical origins as the southern jurisdiction. The way this was done was by a former Ku Klux Klan member, who was actually still secretly a member of the Ku Klux Klan, Chief Justice Hugo Black of the Supreme Court, who introduced and led in introducing measures leading to the so-called separation of church and state. In effect, these Freemasons got God out of the schools and got Satan, or Lucifer, in. And if you don't believe it, you can go to many a secondary school today and otherwise and see it. You can see the insistence that homosexuality be taught as a mandatory course of instruction to first graders in various school systems around the world, around the country. And we see promotion of these same general directions and ideas by the Anti-Defamation League, a branch of the Scottish Rite, with its World of Difference program. It should also be noted that the Anti-Defamation League, like the Scottish Rite, publicly proclaims its commitment to this anti-Christian satanic campaign as part of its long-going, on-standing commitment. So what Plankenest has done is he's put all his troops in concentration toward the front, all his firepower to the front to defend the statue of Pike. In so doing, he has shown his organization's commitment to Pike, which permits those of us who are alert to take a leaf out of the book of Hannibal and attack the flanks of this organization, to expose it for what it is, or rather to point out what it has self-exposed itself publicly to be. This is not simply a quarrel with the southern jurisdiction, of course. This is our effort to get at, to uproot, to expose, and to weaken the pernicious, the treasonous, the satanic influence which the institution of the Confederacy, called the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite, has had to the present day in shaping the United States. Thank you very much.
I have been asked by those who are filming this event to tread water for a couple of seconds while they change tapes. So I'll use the occasion to point out that Lynn, as usual, is good to his word. He spoke 20 minutes. So much for treading water. I think we can now proceed. Our next speaker, Anton Chaikin, known to most of us as Tony Chaikin, is considered by some, or known perhaps best to some, as a historian and investigative journalist, the author of Treason in America and co-author with Webster Tarpley of George Bush, the unauthorized biography. In fact, it is believed by some that that book alone has struck fear into the hearts of many potential presidents of the United States, and they're terrified and have rejected the office because they fear the biography that may be written about them by Tony and Webster. There are no indications that Lynn is concerned. But these are really not the principal attributes of Anton Chaikin. I really think that the most important thing that people need to know about him is that we are standing or seated before an accused statue climber.
I recently got a present, which I have to show you because this is going to help us a lot. You see it? It's the Masonic symbol with a no on it. Right? Yeah. I think this is probably illegal on television, so if they show this, we'll probably have to take it off. I'll wear it later on. The master of Italian Freemasonry and terrorism, Giuseppe Mazzini, supposedly wrote a letter in 1870 to Masonic chief and KKK founder Albert Pike. The subject was how to coordinate world Freemasonry from the top. And it includes these words, quote, "We must create a supreme rite which shall remain secret, into which shall be called those Masons of high degree whom we shall select. Vis-a-vis the other brothers of the Masonry, we must demand utter secrecy. Through this supreme rite, we shall govern the Masonry, which will thus become the international center, all the more powerful that its leadership shall be unknown." The anti-Mason Margiotta wrote that this supermasonry was in fact created with directorates in North America, Uruguay, Naples, and Calcutta. And Albert Pike supposedly wrote a letter to Mazzini in 1871 proposing that they provoke a, quote, "formidable social cataclysm for the purpose of conquering atheistic communism and Christianity by making them exterminate each other," unquote, which would lead to the desired satanic despotism. It is also alleged that in 1889, Pike told higher Masons to worship Lucifer in preference to the other god whose power balances Lucifer. The Scottish Rite Masons themselves present these particular Mazzini and Pike formulations to the public and deny them as forgeries. The British Museum has said carefully that, quote, "a search of the indexes of our catalogues has failed to disclose any letter in the Department of Manuscripts from Albert Pike to Mazzini," unquote. Justice will one day bring us direct physical access to their archives and to any surviving incriminating writings. But we can demonstrate from their acknowledged writings and from historical facts that even if these quotes are forged, they represent exactly the thought and the actions of Pike and Mazzini. Pike wrote the following in his book, Morals and Dogma, writing about top-down organization, quote, "The blue, or lower, degrees are but the outer court of the temple. Part of the symbols are displayed there to the initiate, but he is intentionally misled by false interpretations. It is not intended that he shall understand them, but it is intended that he shall imagine he understands them. Their true explication is reserved for the adepts, the princes of Masonry," unquote. Writing about the satanic balance, Pike wrote, quote, "Manus, founder of the Manichaeans, who had lived and been distinguished among the Persian Magi, profited by the doctrines of Scythianus, a Kabbalist of the times of the apostles. Manus taught that there are two gods, one of good and the other of evil, each independent, eternal, chief of a distinct empire. The evil god, Satan, is the genius of matter alone. The supreme being, that is the other god, was too pure to come in immediate contact with matter. The prince of darkness made Adam, whose soul was of the divine light and his body of matter, so that he belonged to both empires. The demons created Eve, who seduced him into an act of sensualism that enfeebled him and bound him anew in the bonds of matter. This is repeated in the case of every man that lives. And of course, ladies are not permitted in Masonic lodges. The royal secret of which you are the prince is the secret of the universal equilibrium, that equilibrium between good and evil and light and darkness. Unquote. Then, reflecting on decades of terrorist crimes which Pike and Mazzini had directed, Pike wrote, quote, "Men are but the automata, or robots, of Providence, and Providence uses the demagogue, the fanatic, and the knave as its tools and instruments to effect that of which they do not dream, and which they imagine themselves commissioned to prevent." Unquote. The Scottish Rite, as a project of our British enemies, was started during the American Revolution, principally by two men, a nominal Christian and a nominal Jew. British General Augustine Prevost conquered Charleston, South Carolina, and set up a secret police apparatus there, which became the Scottish Rite headquarters after the British Army left South Carolina. Simultaneously, Moses Michael Hayes started in Rhode Island a Masonic core group of Kabbalistic Jews who were millionaires in the Negro slave trade. Among them were the Lopez and De Leon families. Hayes was himself a banking partner of the highest Massachusetts Anglo-Saxon blue blood Tories, who were all in the slave trade. And they would soon plunge into the opium trade. These elements formed the Scottish Rite. Kabbalism, as opposed to biblical Judaism, came into Rhode Island and South Carolina from the Jewish quarter of the island of Curaçao, the Dutch West India Company's slave concentration camp. Slave owners and traders, only nominal Christians or Jews, were forced to flee Caribbean black slave revolts in the 1790s. These embittered Satanists joined the Scottish Rite leadership in Charleston and New Orleans. In Haiti, hereditary slave master Count Alexandre de Grasse led the French planters in their bloody 4-year war against resistant blacks. De Grasse fled to Charleston, where he co-founded the Scottish Rite Mother Lodge in 1801. De Grasse then went back to help lead Napoleon's military campaign against Haiti's independence, a vicious race war which he lost. De Grasse set up the Scottish Rite in British Jamaica in 1803 to help the British govern their 3 million slaves on that island. Under Napoleon in 1804, this genocidalist De Grasse created a Supreme Council for France. De Grasse established the Scottish Rite Supreme Council in Milan in 1805, 2 months before Napoleon came there to be declared King of Italy. This is the origin of the Pike-Mazzini Masonry in Italy. Representing British power, the faction of Masonry opposed to Franklin and Lafayette, De Grasse remained head of the Scottish Rite in France after the fall of Napoleon. Giuseppe Mazzini was a young Italian Freemasonic revolutionist in the 1820s when the British picked him up for their irregular warfare against Europe and America. Mazzini moved to England in the 1830s. From the safety of British upper-class houses, he directed anarchists and terrorists to their deaths against the governments and the church. Mazzini's movements became known as Young Italy, Young Germany, Young Switzerland, Young Russia, and then Young America, and B'nai B'rith, and later on, Young Serbia. Many top British strategists employed Mazzini, beginning with Viscount Palmerston. Mazzini was associated with the schemes of Sir John Bowring, it's B-O-W-R-I-N-G, who tried to stop Germany from industrializing on the American system nationalist program of Alexander Hamilton and Friedrich List. Bowring's other protege, Friedrich Engels, threatened would-be German manufacturers with insurrection to be led by Karl Marx and Mazzini. Bowring's free trade subversion career took him to China, where Bowring started the Second Opium War and organized a communist insurrection led by a messianic Chinese Protestant cult. It was the Taiping Rebellion. Mazzini led Britain's 1848 revolution in Italy, directed against the Catholic Church and designed to stop the Vatican from leading the nationalist movement. In 1852, the U.S. Democratic Party's national magazine said that the new Young America regime of President Franklin Pierce must back Giuseppe Mazzini in the overthrow of Europe's governments. The publisher of the Democratic magazine, George Sanders, a paid agent of British bankers, also called for the USA to seize Cuba and Haiti and secure black slavery under North American rule. As Mazzini's U.S. mouthpiece, Sanders declared that, quote, "this continent is for white people," unquote. But note that Mazzini has even now a false reputation as an anti-slavery activist. President Franklin Pierce had been privately selected as the Democratic nominee by Scottish Rite boss John Quitman, the son of Curaçao slave masters, and by Boston opium lord Caleb Cushing, the sponsor of Albert Pike as his rise to power in Arkansas. Mazzini wrote about his own role in the Pierce election. Quote, Mazzini says, "I am working with the very numerous Germanic element in the United States for his election, and under certain conditions which Pierce has accepted. He was to appoint American representatives in Europe who would be favorable to us and would help us. And almost all his nominations are such as we desired. He was to give to his battleship commanders instructions opposed to Austria and the despotic governments. He has done it. He had promised to give orders to all his diplomatic agents to recognize immediately whatever insurrectionary Republican government should be established in Italian or Hungarian province. And he states that he has done so. This is Mazzini talking about his role in affecting the election of President Pierce and what he's getting in return. President Pierce appointed George Sanders consul in London, where Sanders hosted in his home Mazzini's entire crew of revolutionists. They made that place their headquarters. Other open Mazziniites, such as Edwin de Leon and Scottish Rite bankroller August Belmont, got top diplomatic posts, while Pike's sponsor Cushing ran the Pierce administration as Attorney General of the United States. Operating at that time in Switzerland, Mazzini was assured by the U.S. ambassador there that if Mazzini were arrested, he would be immediately taken under the ambassador's protection. This is what Mazzini says in his letters to the English family that he's staying with. Under this Pierce regime, the Scottish Rite prepared a slave owners' war on the USA. Quitman sent the new Scottish Rite member Albert Pike to live in Louisiana in 1855. Pike developed the New Orleans base of the anti-Catholic, anti-black terrorist group, the Knights of the Golden Circle. Pike worked with Caribbean Jewish Kabbalist Judah Benjamin and the strange British agent Catholics who would pave the way for the introduction of Mazzini's Mafia in New Orleans. Within the overall movement to unify Italy, Mazzini worked to create new instruments for crime and covert dictatorship. In 1860, Mazzini sent just 1,000 red shirts under General Garibaldi to invade Sicily. Sicily was then ruled by Bourbon royalty. Now, how did such a small force succeed? These Sicilian mafia, by then ruled by Mazzini's command, crippled the government's response from within Sicily. But to make sure, the British Navy moved into position to protect the landing of the 2 ships that were sent down from Genoa. And Sicily was conquered. That same year, with Albert Pike as commander, in 1860, the Scottish Rite marshaled the slave owners' political leaders, secured the backing of British bankers Rothschild and Baring, and launched the secession of the U.S. South. The 1850s Mazziniite regime of Franklin Pierce now became the 1860s insurrectionary government. Pierce's Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, was the Confederate president. Judah Benjamin, as Confederate Secretary of State, directed the Scottish Rite espionage networks, with George Sanders and Edwin de Leon running on British funds between Canada and Europe. While British shipyards built cruisers for the Confederacy to sink the U.S. merchant marine, pro-Confederate English politicians got Mazzini's main public spokesman, Sir James Stansfeld, appointed Lord of the Admiralty. This is in the middle of the American Civil War. The United States won the Civil War, but its nationalist president, Abraham Lincoln, was murdered by the Pike-Benjamin Secret Service. At Ford's Theater, where John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln, the National Park Service displays a decoding sheet found by the police in Booth's trunk and a matching coding device found in the office of Judah Benjamin. Albert Pike was hiding in British Canada, wanted for treason by this country, when the new Masonic president, Andrew Johnson, issued him a pardon. The nationalist leader of the U.S. Congress, Thaddeus Stevens, a fierce opponent of Freemasonry, launched Reconstruction to overthrow the Southern oligarchy and to ensure rights to the blacks newly freed from slavery. Albert Pike restarted the terrorist Knights of the Golden Circle, calling it the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, which fought Reconstruction with satanic costumes and rituals and murders. The Scottish Rite, the home base of their home base in South Carolina, was conquered by General Sherman, and it remained for years under a regime of talented and patriotic black leaders. This is after the Civil War, including Amelia Robinson's great uncle, U.S. Congressman Robert Smalls. In the late 1870s, the Pike KKK forces ran phony scandals to overthrow these black leaders, corruption scandals. The former slave owners then seized control of South Carolina. And I have seen on display in Charleston the startling Mazziniite red shirt uniforms that these vigilante forces wore when they lynched and tortured and shot their way back into power in South Carolina. Thus, Mazzini and Pike corresponded. Mazzini created the secret Propaganda Uno Lodge, which ruled Italy for many decades. Pike and Mazzini co-founded the Scottish Rite organizations of Latin America. Mazzini's mafia spread into New Orleans. So the Jewish and Italian mafiosi who have nested there in New Orleans are the queer Masonic birds whose parents and continuing controllers are these ultra-racists that we have described. Their hemisphere-wide dope trafficking is in fact intended to exterminate Christianity. The Propaganda Due, or P2 Lodge, was established on the Mazzini model by the Anglo-Americans after World War II. In cooperation with communist secret services, the Scottish Rite P2 has run terrorism against the nation of Italy. Italian police trying to penetrate the Masonic control of criminal terrorism recently ran up against the covert Albert Pike Lodge in Calabria. Though now officially outlawed, P2, set up by the Anglo-Americans, is spearheading the current crusade to scandalize, dismember, and subjugate Italy. The heirs of Pike and Mazzini are the new KKK, the neo-Nazis hammering at Germany. Dennis Mahon, the Oklahoma KKK leader and naval intelligence operative who trains young German neo-Nazis, admits that he works with the Stasi, secret police, the former communist Stasi, to wreck Germany, that is today. And Mahon praises KKK founder Albert Pike as a pioneer 19th century environmentalist. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, who heads up a neo-Nazi unit of the United States Army, is the high priest of the Satanic Temple of Set, the officially recognized satanic religion in the U.S. Army. An up-to-date Pike-Mazzini team has worked on behalf of Britain's strategy of tension against Germany. The neo-Nazis are run by the High Mason Aquino and by intelligence chiefs William Webster and Ted Shackley, and by Kabbalist mobster Edgar Bronfman. So this is the neo-Nazi operation in Germany. Now that the Scottish Rite is panicking and coming out into the open to defend their KKK, we should recommend to law enforcement officials everywhere, watch the Masonic offices for smoke. They may soon be burning their private papers, and we shall want those papers rescued to aid in future prosecutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. As you can see, a completely unrepentant statue climber. Our next presentation is from Mark Calney. Mark is not with us today. He is sick. Many of you know him as a researcher and author. He has written a recent New Federalist series of articles on the subject of today's presentation, which is D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, Hollywood and the KKK. Mark's paper will be read for us by Khushro Gandhi.
On the evening of March 24th, 3 days from now, PBS television will premiere a documentary entitled D.W. Griffith, Father of Film. The highlight of this fawning tribute to Griffith is his film Birth of a Nation. This is occurring at the same time that a fight has broken out, led by the NAACP, to prevent the U.S. Library of Congress from placing Birth of a Nation into its prestigious National Film Registry. NAACP Chairman Gibson has recently stated, quote, "We do not believe in censorship and therefore accept the idea of preserving this film for future scholars, historians, and educators. We feel the film can be preserved, however, without adding it to the National Film Registry or cloaking it in any mantle of distinction or honor. Those who view this D.W. Griffith work must be fully aware of what this film was and what it was meant to be, a distorted, dishonest propaganda recruiting vehicle for the Ku Klux Klan members and sympathizers." The release of Griffith's 1915 motion picture, Birth of a Nation, originally entitled The Klansman, was that vehicle which created two closely related phenomena. First, a revival of the Ku Klux Klan as a mass-based organization in the United States, and second, the establishment of Hollywood as the new Babylon of modern culture. Hollywood as an institution did not begin as an innocent collection of artsy filmmakers, but that somehow was taken over and corrupted in recent times. It was rotten at its inception. The Birth of a Nation presented a rewriting of the actual history of Reconstruction by the same Confederate traitors against whom the war had been fought. It portrayed African Americans in the post-Civil War South as depraved, lascivious beasts whose rampant lawlessness and alleged domination of the South through military force and control of courts and state legislatures threatened to destroy Southern civilization and mongrelize the races. The film glorifies the lynchings and reign of terror carried out by the new secret order of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. These twin evils, Hollywood and the KKK, come from the circle of elite Anglo-Americans who were the direct heirs, philosophically and often physically, of the old Confederacy. And they are the same treasonous scoundrels who organized the entry of the United States into the First World War on the side of the British Empire, and the establishment of the Versailles system at the end of that war. The creation of the Klan in 1865 and its later revival at the beginning of this century was not a spontaneous phenomenon. In both cases, we find the guiding hand of those individuals and institutions, such as the Scottish Rite Masonic Order, who have always opposed the Republican principles upon which the U.S. was founded. The initiating ceremony reviving the Klan occurred on Thanksgiving Eve of 1915, atop Stone Mountain, just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, when a small group of men, which included former members of the original Klan, followed the new Klan leader, Colonel William J. Simmons, in a cross-burning ritual. That spectacle coincided with the opening presentation of Birth of a Nation 1 week later, also in Atlanta. Announcements of the film debut in the local newspaper were accompanied by Colonel Simmons' proclamation of the establishment of a new, invisible empire of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Birth of a Nation was literally a recruitment film for the KKK, and the target of its revival was not principally the South, but was the old Union strongholds of the North. Griffith's 2-hour and 45-minute motion picture brazenly promoted the ideas of white race supremacy. This dovetailed with the ongoing British Empire campaign of eugenics, the so-called race science, which found its most enthusiastic sponsors among such Anglo-American financiers as John D. Rockefeller and Averell Harriman. The central theme of Anglo-Saxon supremacy was the vehicle used to recruit large numbers of members into the Klan. Give the transparency. By 1923, the high-water mark of Klan recruitment, the Klan's active membership was estimated at 1.5 million. The total number of members enrolled from 1915 to 1944 has been estimated at over 2 million. As you can see from the chart, the majority of Klan members were in the northern states, with the largest base of support in any one city being Chicago, with 20 Klan chapters totaling 50,000 members. D.W. Griffith's film, Birth of a Nation, was based on a 1905 book written by Thomas Dixon, Jr., titled The Klansman, an historic romance of the Ku Klux Klan. and which he dedicated to the memory of a Scottish-Irish leader, this is a quote, of the South, my uncle, Colonel Leroy McTee, Grand Titan of the Ku Klux Klan. Dixon considered himself the great defender of the Anglo-Saxon race, claiming that the beginning of Negro equality is the beginning of the end of this nation's life. Dixon was born in Shelby, North Carolina in 1864. In the 1880s, Dixon attended Johns Hopkins University, and while there became a close friend of another Southerner, a Virginian by the name of Woodrow Wilson, who would play an important role in the future of Birth of a Nation. It was as a Baptist minister that Dixon first achieved fame. He formed a non-denominational People's Church in downtown Manhattan, where he first caught the eye of John D. Rockefeller, who talked of building him a great tabernacle. In 1899, he turned to public lecturing and wrote his racist trilogy of novels. The first, The Leopard's Spots, subtitled A Romance of the White Man's Burden, 1865 to 1900, was written in 1902 and concluded that peace could only be achieved through separation of the races. Dixon submitted his manuscript of Leopard's Spots for publication to an old friend from North Carolina, Walter Hines Page, who had become the co-owner of the New York publishing firm of Doubleday, Page & Company. A virulent Confederate Anglophile who as a child had witnessed Sherman's army march past his North Carolina home, Page later became U.S. ambassador to Great Britain under President Woodrow Wilson and played a critical role in organizing American entry into World War I on the side of the British. Page eagerly published Dixon's book, which sold more than 100,000 copies in the first 3 months of its release. The publication of The Klansman in 1905 outsold Dixon's first 2 books and was produced as a play. In 1906, Dixon's other novel, The One Woman, was rewritten by him as a play, and he asked then little-known actor to perform the lead role, D.W. Griffith. David Wark Griffith was born on a small farm near Louisville in 1875. His father, Jacob Wark Griffith, at the outbreak of the Civil War, joined the Confederate Army and became a colonel. After the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox, the Confederate Secretary of State, Breckinridge, assigned Colonel Griffith the ill-fated task of attempting to secretly escort the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, to a safe house in Kentucky in hopes of continuing the existence of the Confederate government. During the filming of Birth of a Nation, Griffith would brag that his father had ridden with the Ku Klux Klan. As a young man, Griffith moved to Louisville, where he began to undertake an acting career and where he first joined the Masons. By 1913, Griffith was the head of production and a film director for Mutual Film Production, owned by Harry and Roy Aitken, and had already begun to shoot films during the winter months in Hollywood, California. In 1914, Griffith and an associate, film critic Frank Woods, obtained the copyright for the motion picture production of Dixon's book, The Klansman. Griffith tells the story in his autobiography. Quote, "One fortunate day, Woods brought a book to me. It was The Klansman by Dixon. I skipped quickly through the book until I got to the part about the Klansman, who, according to no less than Woodrow Wilson, ran to the rescue of the downtrodden South after the Civil War. I could just see these Klansmen in a movie with their white robes flying." Unquote. In addition to hiring the Reverend Dixon to help draft the script, Griffith drew heavily on Woodrow Wilson's A History of the American People for the written dialogue of the movie. Shooting of The Klansman started in 1914 on Griffith's studio lot in Sunset Boulevard, Hollywood. The music was written for a 40-piece orchestra with an offstage chorus and sound effects. In addition to the use of popular Civil War songs, the musical accompaniment drew heavily from various classical composers, and most importantly from Richard Wagner. Wagner, a worse anti-Semite than Adolf Hitler and an Anglo-Saxon race patriot in his own right, was appropriately used in providing the music of his Ride of the Valkyries for the Klan Ride. The official premiere of Griffith's Klansman took place on February 8, 1915 in Los Angeles. The opening, however, was not greeted with open arms by all. The small local chapter of the Los Angeles NAACP had gone into court in an attempt to obtain an injunction against the film. The legal argument employed, which was to be used subsequently by other NAACPs around the nation, was on the grounds that exhibiting the film would be a threat to public safety by heightening racial tensions and would incite violence and possible rioting. The NAACP was not successful. Less than 2 weeks after its LA premiere, The Klansman was to open in New York City. After a private showing to a select group in New York, including Dixon, it was decided to rename the film Birth of a Nation. However, simply changing the name in Griffith's cinematic bottle of poison was not deemed adequate by the film's creators to stave off the expected adverse public reaction to such an explicit display of Confederate treason. Therefore, it was decided that before the film's public opening, it would be wise to garner endorsements for the film by some of America's more respectable establishment figures. Thinking big, Mr. Griffith and his KKK roadshow headed south for Washington. Dixon wrote a letter to his old friend from Johns Hopkins University, now President Woodrow Wilson, requesting a half-hour interview, which the president granted. As a result, on February 18, 1915, The Klansman became the first motion picture ever to be shown in the White House. Wilson's comment after viewing the film was, quote, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true," unquote. This quote was quickly put into general circulation to promote the picture. Then it was on to the U.S. Supreme Court, where Reverend Dixon, during a private meeting, discovered that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Edward White, had been a member of the old Ku Klux Klan. White and other Supreme Court justices, as well as select congressmen and others, attended again a private showing of Birth of a Nation. After its New York premiere on March 3, 1915, newspaper reviews of essentially all the major press sidestepped the racial controversy and only had praise for the film. The Hearst Evening Journal was typical. Quote, "First of all, children must be sent to this masterpiece. Any parent who neglects this advice is committing an educational offense, for no film has ever produced more educational points than Griffith's latest achievement." Unquote. During its filming, someone had mentioned to Griffith that if the film was ever shown in Atlanta, the result would be a race riot, to which Griffith prophetically replied, "I hope to God they do," unquote. In most of the northern cities where Birth of a Nation was scheduled to be shown, political fights exploded, and some small race riots did occur in Philadelphia, Boston, and elsewhere. The NAACP and others, attempting to seek either a banning of the film completely or to force the editing out of its most egregious racist scenes. For the most part, those attempts failed. Endless hearings were held before mayors, state legislatures, and others around the country. The hearings became public platforms for the pro-Griffith lobby to pronounce the alleged virtues of eugenics and racial purification. Griffith's lawyer, Martin Littleton, told New York City Mayor Mitchell that the film was, quote, "a protest against the mongrel mixture of black and white," unquote. Griffith would insist until his dying day that Birth of a Nation was the gospel truth. In self-righteous indignation, Griffith authored a mass pamphlet entitled "The Rise and Fall of Free Speech," which argued against any attempts to censor his film. His letters and articles were printed in papers across the country. In one case, he prophetically envisioned the future use of film and the creation of today's video culture. He stated that, quote, "the next generation will be wedded to the movies. You will not be able to satisfy them with anything else," unquote. He envisioned the elimination of libraries and historical researchers to be replaced by a priesthood of cinema experts, such as himself. His next cinema project, Intolerance, was his answer to his critics. The film is truly Masonic in theme and content. The focus of the film's substance and production cost were devoted to depicting ancient Babylon, which Griffith titles, quote, "the first known court of justice in the world." This is the actual film set. Birth of a Nation, however, was a monumental box office smash, unlike Intolerance, which flopped. And as one of the actresses, Lillian Gish, later stated in an interview, quote, "they lost track of the money it was making. But it started all," this is a quote, "but it started all of the fortunes of Louis B. Mayer, all the people in films." At a time when the average entrance fee to a movie theater was 15 cents, the cost of Birth of a Nation was $2. In some cities, it ran continuously for almost a year. At one point, there were 28 companies touring the film throughout the world. Estimates of the total box office take vary anywhere from $50 to $100 million, though production costs were less than $100,000. It became apparent to all that there were big profits to be made in motion pictures. So the floodgates opened and money poured into Hollywood. Felix Kahn, one of the earliest investors in Birth of a Nation, sold his large New York theater to Paramount and became a member of its board of directors. Through Felix Kahn, Paramount owner Adolf Zukor met his brother Otto Kahn, a partner in the Warburg financial firm of Kuhn Loeb. By 1919, Zukor had arranged a $10 million loan from Kuhn Loeb and had launched the Paramount film empire. Warner Brothers became a major studio with the 1925 investment of Goldman Sachs. The man who became the movie mogul of Columbia Pictures, Harry Cohn, was a notorious and ardent supporter of Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. Cohn made a documentary of Il Duce, and after visiting him in Rome, returned to Hollywood where he decorated his office to match that of the Italian dictators. He kept a photograph of Mussolini on his desk even through World War II. Harry Cohn was not the only member of the Mussolini Hollywood fan club. In 1924, on his return from Italy, Griffith told the New York press, quote, "Mussolini is a great man. With the allegiance of youth behind him, he could do great things. Who knows but that he may be a Napoleon who'll sweep the world. I believe that anything may happen as a result of this fascism. I should like to put into a film the remarkable spirit of the fascisti," unquote. Not long after the re-election of Woodrow Wilson in 1916, Griffith was summoned by Wilson to the White House and asked to go to Europe to produce a propaganda film supporting the British and French cause against the Germans. A meeting was arranged for Griffith with then Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain, at which the Prime Minister informed Griffith that, quote, he had the greatest power in his hands for the control of men's minds that the world had ever seen, unquote, and that he should undertake Winston Churchill's idea for a film scenario promoting the war effort. Quote, I want you to go to work for France and England and make up Americans' mind to go to war with us. Griffith readily accepted, and with the financial backing of the French and British, proceeded to produce a film called Hearts of the World, a propaganda film. On April 16th, the United States joined the British Empire and declared war on Germany. The film's portrayal of the German Huns as beasts, not unlike his portrayal of blacks in Birth of a Nation, would have an effect in shaping the post-war climate of the Versailles Treaty. The high point of Griffith's tour in Britain was a formal audience at Buckingham Palace with the Queen and Queen Mother. In his autobiography, he said, quote, now I was going to meet the queens. Filled with dreams, I was determined to make an impression on these ladies, one they would never forget. In fact, I was mentally already in the bosom of the royal family. Not long after his return to Hollywood, Griffith established United Artists in 1919 with Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and Mary Pickford. The film studio, which was to dominate Hollywood, began as a result of Birth of a Nation. In 1915, Louis Mayer ran a distributorship for a small string of theaters in Massachusetts. As Birth of a Nation was about to start, he arranged a deal to distribute the film for a roughly 50-50 split of the box office receipts. In that single deal, Mayer made well over $500,000. And with that money, Mayer went on to ultimately found the mother of all Hollywood studios, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. In 1939, shortly after Hitler and Stalin had occupied Poland, MGM Associates released its full-length color epic based on the Confederate tradition of Griffith's Birth of a Nation. The film, which premiered in Atlanta, Georgia, was Gone with the Wind, often called the greatest movie ever made. The film was based on the racist book authored by Margaret Mitchell, who wrote to her mentor, Reverend Thomas Dixon, after her success, to tell him that his writings had been her inspiration since childhood. The movie was produced by Louis Mayer's son-in-law, David Selznick, and financed by Jock Whitney of the New York Herald Tribune, a scion of the Harriman family. Ben Hecht, the man who wrote the script for the film, later became the chief propagandist and fundraiser in the United States for the terrorist Irgun. And during World War II, Hecht organized the first Irgun fundraiser for Hollywood's elites in the commissary of 20th Century Fox. The man on the right is Louis B. Mayer, and next to him is Dory Sherry. As if Hollywood films weren't bad enough already, Sherry was the man who created the idea of the B-grade movie. He then became vice president in charge of production for MGM. Dory was a lifelong friend of one of Meyer Lansky's top aides, Abner Longies-Willman, and in 1963, after Sherry quit Hollywood, he became the national director of the Anti-Defamation League. Beginning in the early 20s, dozens of Hollywood executives, directors, and actors joined the Los Angeles B'nai B'rith, including Harry and Jack Warner, Louis Meyer, Irving Thalberg, and William Fox. Many of them, like the Warner brothers, also joined the Masons. I won't elaborate on the organized crime connections here of Hollywood, which would be a much longer speech. When D.W. Griffith died in June 23rd, 1948, his Hollywood service was not held in a church, but at the Hollywood Masonic Temple. His pallbearers included Louis Meyer and Sam Goldwyn. Afterwards, he was buried in his hometown in Kentucky. Now we want to see a few clips of the film Birth of a Nation, which will give you a pretty good sense of what the film is about. If there's... All right. Lights. This is from the legislature. They're showing black rule. South Carolina is the image of it, was the model. Of course, in this, you can't hear the music in the background. This is the colonel, the little colonel who is going to found the Ku Klux Klan. And this is where he gets his inspiration. These two little white children, they put a sheet over their head. And they scare the little children away. This is a lynching. For rape of a white woman, of course. Quick trial. governor, of course, is black, so they're throwing the corpse on his doorstep. This is the black soldiers about to break in. The men are about to kill the women if necessary. This is the famous Klan ride from the movie. The music for this is the Ride of the Valkyries, which you can't hear. They're coming in to save the day. And that's basically it. In conclusion, let me just say that if we're going to eliminate the cultural scourge, oh, it's not finished. This is the triumphal final scene here. They've charged into a town, they've saved all of the white women, who were all on the verge of being raped. And if we're going to eliminate the cultural scourge of Hollywood with all its sordid collection of pimps, whores, and criminals, it will not be done by simply boycotting your local video store or television set. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the founding of two of the most treasonous institutions in the United States, the Federal Reserve Bank and the Anti-Defamation League. Let us work to ensure that 1993 witnessed the demise of these twin evils. If we do that, the fall of Hollywood will not be far behind, and we can return the handiwork of D.W. Griffith back to the ground of its old Kentucky home.
Particularly interested to see that trial scene. Now we know where the rocket docket came from also. Virginia Justice, and so on and so forth. Incidentally, we will have messages of greetings read to the conference shortly, a bit later this morning, from Michael Billington and from Shelley Asher. But right now I would like to proceed, if the video film is ready, with the next presentation, which is by Michael Minnicino. Mike has been the author of numerous studies on the subject of the Tavistock going back to 1974, studies on the Frankfurt School, and have been printed in the New Federalist and upcoming publications as well. An article on political correctness recently printed in Fidelio magazine, and so on. The subject of Mike's presentation today is the Frankfurt School and its demonic influence on modern culture, which you already know a little bit about.
Most of what you see and hear around you, not only when you turn on your TV set or your radio, but when you simply walk down the street, most of this is based upon theories that are designed to drive you stark raving mad. Today, American culture is dominated by a group of theories which can be usefully lumped together under the term postmodernism. These include all manner of so-called political correctness, multiculturalism, Afrocentrism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, different, often hostile ideologies. But they all share a core philosophy. Stripped of the jargon, postmodernism is really very old stuff and can be traced to the racist ideology of Aristotle. But the proximate origins of the philosophy that we're dealing with today can be traced to three sources: the proto-Nazi 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, the card-carrying Nazi 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger, and the nominally communist philosophers of the so-called Frankfurt School. And no postmodernist of today would disagree, no matter what stripe they are, with this characterization of their ideology. The purpose of all postmodernist theory is to create what Georg Lukács, the founder of the Frankfurt School, called the culture of pessimism. That culture, art, music, literature, and the banal, popularized versions of that we call entertainment, could be turned into a weapon of social control if, and only if, the optimism which is inherent in Western Judeo-Christian civilization could be subverted. Back in 1922, Lukács was commissioned by the Communist International to figure out why Bolshevism had not succeeded beyond the borders of Russia. He and the group of Marxist theorists, which he gathered together in Frankfurt, Germany, determined that the problem was, to make a very long story short, that the West still had the concept of a soul. That is, despite the despite the pessimism that was widespread amongst cultural elites, especially after the collapse of the United States as a moral superpower after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Despite this pessimism, there was a countervailing tendency, an optimistic tendency within Western civilization. The West still taught that the individual had a soul, a divine spark of reason, that through the exercise of reason, the individual could discern with ever greater clarity God's plan of creation, which meant that no matter how bad things got, there was always the hope that mankind could solve its problems. Now, the Frankfurt School determined that this optimism could not stand if there were to be revolution in the West. As Lukács, the founder of the Frankfurt School, wrote at the time, people must become convinced that they live in a world that has been abandoned by God, and that their only hope is revolution. And now in this, Lukács was echoing very consciously the sentiments of his acknowledged forebear, Friedrich Nietzsche, who had written, and I quote, "We must give the coup de grace to that other and even more fatal atomism that Christianity has been teaching, the atomism of the soul. Let us be permitted to use that term to denote the belief that regards the soul as something ineradicable, eternal, indivisible, as a monad. That belief must be thrown out of science," unquote. Now, Nietzsche's specification of Leibniz's concept of the monad is crucial here. For all postmodernist theory, from Nietzsche on, depends absolutely on the denial of the individual sovereign power of creative reason, as discussed by Leibniz. Now, the Frankfurt School and its collaborators determined that the easiest angle of attack was on the highest expressions of Judeo-Christian culture itself. New theories had to be created to radically redefine art in such a way as to prove that science in art was not possible. That the basic technologies that had been developed so that art might embody the soaring aspirations of mankind were merely outdated bourgeois niceties. For instance, the very basic stuff, that the concept of the narrative, that art has a story to tell, was obsolete. That figuration and perspective, the breakthrough by which an artist can bring us into the space of a painting, was obsolete. That tonality and the lawful development in music or poetry was obsolete. These theories were developed, and they are the operant theories of art today. These theories are the single reason why most of you in this audience can look at an example of modern art, modern music, modern poetry, and say, that's silly, that's stupid. But all of the critics and most of the professors can respond, you poor, unsophisticated person. Don't you realize this is great art? And it's worth a lot more money than you'll ever see. Let me give you a little taste of how this operates. If we could have the lights down a bit and the slides. Are we ready? Okay. Vincent van Gogh. Obvious title, Three Pairs of Shoes. 1887. Now, a lot of people like Van Gogh. I'm sorry I could only had time to get a black and white slide. Doesn't hurt the argument. I show this slide because Martin Heidegger, the Nazi founder of existentialism, wrote a very influential essay on this particular picture. Heidegger says that what makes this painting a breakthrough is that it is not just a still life, still lives not having people in them, but the choice of shoes without people as opposed to fruit or flowers. As the subject of the painting is actually a polemic, because it forces the viewer to recognize that the shoes have been detached from the people who wear them. So that the painting is a conscious statement of dehumanization. And because the painting is forcibly dehumanized, says Martin Heidegger, you have a better concept of the painting as an object of art, and the viewer, you, can understand more clearly your position as a member of dehumanized society. And Heidegger adds that this polemic is aided by the conscious degeneration of perspective here. Okay. It works. 20 years later, the narrative, which is still more or less there in the Van Gogh, is now almost gone. Perspective has more or less disappeared. The painting does not exist in your space. In fact, it doesn't even exist in your time. The figure in the bottom right corner is painted consciously in two different time frames. We have, with Picasso and his collaborators, the conscious primitivization of art, a reversal, a conscious reversal of centuries of development. 20 years later, you don't need to bother with the obsolete concepts of narrative, figuration, or perspective. Grade school geometry and color juxtaposition will suffice. 20 years later, you don't need more than one color. 20 years later, and the polemic takes its mature form. I see all the Ballantine fans out there. What's happening here? There is no art. There is no art. There are just things. There are just feeling states and individual values. Art is whatever I say is art. Now, the same thing is true in architecture. Here is the recently completed international headquarters of ATT in Manhattan by Philip Johnson, who is the most influential architect in America today and a leading postmodern. Those of you who are familiar with antique furniture will notice that the building is topped with what looks suspiciously like a Chippendale furniture ornament. And that is what it is. The architect claims that by putting a 50-story antique set of drawers in the middle of New York, he has forced the viewer to rethink his or her concepts of the purpose of architecture. Now, just compare in your minds for a second. I don't have the slides. Compare in your minds the moral purpose of the architects of the Parthenon or the Chartres Cathedral with the moral purpose of the architect of this nonsense. Now, there's also an extremist wing of postmodern architecture, which is called literally deconstructionist architecture. And you'll hear more about deconstructionism specifically later on in this conference. This is real. This is the Best Product showroom in Towson, Maryland. It's about an hour from here. You can see that a terrible natural disaster has torn the facade off. Unfortunately, in this case, the natural disaster was the deconstructionist architect. And here's my personal favorite. This is a multi-million-dollar new research center at the University of Stuttgart in Germany. False facades, exposed pipes that lead nowhere, and a window hung by a chimpanzee. No offense to chimpanzees. Now, what I have shown you is ugly. It was meant to be ugly. All of this is supposed to be great art, according to the Frankfurt School and the other postmodernists, because it forces you to accept the truth that life is ugly under capitalism, and that you have no soul, and that your life leads nowhere, except whatever bodily titillation that you might obtain along the way. Now, I could, if we had the time, do a comparable demonstration for today's literature, poetry, dance, music. All of it ugly. All of it based explicitly on these theories. All of it designed to reverse, consciously, thousands of years of human mental development. And that's why postmodernism has been so heavily sponsored over the last 25 to 30 years. Postmodernist artistic theory is the cultural expression of post-industrial economic theory. It says that the only form of progress possible is the advance of the individual's hedonism. Now, unfortunately, the work of the Frankfurt School was not limited to the theoretical, as you can partially say. When Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, the Frankfurt School was relocated to the United States through the good offices of the Rockefeller Foundation, the American Jewish Committee, and Columbia University. One of the most important operations of the school in America was something called the Radio Project, set up with funds from CBS Network and the federal government at Princeton University in 1936. The dominant force in the Radio Project was the Frankfurt School's Theodor Adorno, who had realized that there had to be new forms of culture created to complete the dehumanization and alienation of society. Especially important, said Adorno, was leisure activity, for that was the period when people sat down to think. They threatened to think, potentially dangerous to the Frankfurt School's plans. Adorno identified that the introduction of the motion picture, radio, and television, and Adorno was one of the very first people to talk about the theoretical implications of television back in the 1940s, that these things had begun to change the way people approached art. Adorno realized that the electronic mass media were a kind of universal solvent. They reduced everything to entertainment. For instance, you put a masterpiece of classical music on the radio, and most people actually don't hear the piece as an intellectual whole. They split it up into the easy or familiar parts that entertain them, and into the difficult parts, which they forget instantaneously. People, said Adorno, become more primitive in their listening and approach art just like sports. And he said, and I quote, "They are not childlike, the listeners, you and me, but they are childish. Their primitivism is not that of the undeveloped, but that of the forcibly retarded," unquote. Now, the radio project actually developed instrumentalities based upon this analysis. The most important of these is something called the Stanton-Lazarsfeld Program Analyzer, officially. It's known in the business as Little Annie, a device for testing programming. The test audience is hooked up to a rheostat which can register the degrees of like and dislike over the course of a show. So the purpose is not to determine what people thought of the show as a whole, because that requires higher mental functioning in which the radio project was uninterested, but to gauge the moment-to-moment feeling states of the audience. Then the dissociated moments could be reproduced, and this device is now used, has been, and is today universally used to test all new television, all new film, all new radio and commercial programming. That's why there's nothing new on television. Certain plot situations, certain pairing of actors, certain musical accompaniment that rate highly on these devices are transposed, combined, recombined, recombined endlessly, and people watch it because they're looking actually at something very familiar, like an old sweater. And in the 1980s, Little Annie, this device, was universally started to be used in political campaigns. And the man who owns the largest program analyzer in this country used in politics is Robert Teeter, who was George Bush's 1992 campaign manager. You see, TV is the triumph of postmodernist theory, as Adorno predicted it would be. Everything becomes superficial. That's from Don Hewitt, who was the founder of 60 Minutes. Everything becomes desensitized, dehumanized. Television news is not information, it is entertainment. The network anchors are not journalists, they're entertainers. ABC's Peter Jennings was created by careful profiles by Roone Ardledge, the head of ABC Sports. People who think they are informed love to watch the political talk shows. They don't understand it's carefully crafted entertainment. It's called value conflict in the business. You have a stock conservative character, you have a stock liberal character, you have a mediator who's neutral, they throw zingers at each other, you root for your team, and it's all designed that way as entertainment. Over the last few years, TV has begun to fulfill the role set for it by Adorno, especially with the introduction of the immensely popular rock videos, which shrink the attention span down to 2 minutes of irrationalism and pornography. This is a statement by the man who created Mort Downey that went on to found MTV, and he is now a media advisor to Albert Gore. We are now fulfilling the horrible circle that has been set up for us by the Frankfurt School. Now, incidentally, the radio project also was responsible for the development of modern public opinion polling, which since 1972 has been in partnership with TV, the dominant force in American elections. And the pollsters go to great lengths, like this statement of George Gallup in the 1940s, to say how scientific and important they are. Of course, George Gallup's assistant had a slightly different point of view. Polls are a wonderful example of cognitive dissonance. Everybody says they don't trust them and everybody believes them. They're garbage, even if the results say what you want them to say. The whole concept is absurd if you think about it, because it depends on your denial of your own soul, your own sovereign soul. A monad is a majority by definition. In questions of morality and science, the truth carries the majority. even if only one person knows the truth. In addition, technically polls don't exist, and if people want to find out how that works in the question period, we can. Where does this all lead? Could we quickly get to the videotape? Because they're about to put the hook on me. Forget it. I'll just describe it. What it is merely an... Are you all being entertained? This is not, it's not this self-reflexive. This is very postmodernist to be just constantly self-reflexive like this. Yeah, exactly. Now people know I'm real because they've seen me on television. There it is.
Continuing our discussion now with Lyndon LaRouche. Mr. LaRouche, we're almost out of time, but as you know, as a credible presidential candidate, you're going to have to learn to talk in television sound bites. So give me your vision.
That's it. That's all I wanted to show. Postmodernism's ultimate goal, is to make you incapable of participation in the political process. Can I have that one last slide? To make you believe, as the Frankfurt School's Walter Benjamin said, and you'll get that slide in just a second, and he said this 50 years ago, that politics have no moral end. It's just another form of entertainment where you root for your team against the other team and vote the way the polls tell you to vote. Ted Koppel's comment to Lynn says it all. Most people have been trained to be hostile to complicated answers and to accept the kind of calculated superficialities that ratify their own prejudices. The American people have been, in Adorno's phrase, forcibly retarded. Now, I want all of you in the audience to think of yourselves as educators. Education, in the very first instance, aims at increasing the child's attention span so that the real work of education can begin. That is what we must do. This nation will not survive without a population that is capable of understanding complicated answers, like those given by Lyndon LaRouche and written weekly in New Federalist. We must help our fellow citizens look past the ugliness that is making them stupid and let them see the beauty which is mankind's birthright. Thank you.
Conspiracy by traitors to the United States, and they were outright traitors, to destroy the United States. The failure of this treason in 1814 led to the new conspiracy to divide the United States into two parts by secession, one a southern group of states committed to slavery, and the other a northern group of states committed to abolition of slavery. Though the northerners, such as the Lowell family of George Bundy's ancestors, while objecting to slavery in Massachusetts, did not object to it in the South. In fact, they benefited greatly from the use of slave-produced cotton for the New England cotton mills, like Friedrich Engels, the scoundrel whose wealth was derived from the use of slave cotton in England. After the Civil War, with the execution of Lincoln, by circles which were associated with the treasonous southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite, and with its B'nai B'rith offshoot, which was the racist, treasonous and racist section of American Judaism, a very small, a small minority of American Judaism at the time, Lincoln was assassinated by these people and their friends, and a more agreeable president, at least from the standpoint of the traitor standpoint, Andrew Johnson became president. As a result of a number of developments leading into the election of such atrocities as Confederate sympathizers, Teddy Roosevelt, whose ideas were shaped by his uncle, a Confederate traitor, Bullock, and the Confederate president, that is the Confederate who became president, Woodrow Wilson, who, among other things, incidentally co-sponsored the founding or refounding of the Ku Klux Klan in 1915. This nation was gradually taken over by the same group of people, the same group of racist traitors who formed the Confederacy earlier. To this date, the internal history of the United States and the conflict in the United States position in the world as a ally of British imperialism and similar evil enterprises has been based on a takeover of more and more of the institutions of the United States by the circles associated with the leadership of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. These are the racists. These are the authors of the accomplices of those who set forth 2 world wars in this century. These are the people who committed all of the atrocities against the peoples of the Caribbean region of South and Central America from the United States. These are the people who have trampled upon our Constitution, who have trampled upon our economy by introducing things like the Federal Reserve System and so forth. These are the actual enemies of the United States, not because of, although each is accountable in his own person for what he does, the essence of the matter is this association of people who are in the tradition of Palmerston, Pike, and Mazzini in leading institutions in the United States, those who are in the tradition of the drug runners of the Perkins Syndicate and Russell Company today. So therefore, I'm very happy that C. Fred Kleinknecht has chosen to attack me so frequently and so violently by name, and to seek to mobilize all Freemasonic officers and through lodges throughout the country in the general mobilization against me. Because this indicates that the Freemasons recognize that we, those Freemasons in particular, recognize that we have become a significant threat to their power, chiefly by our raising during my presidential campaign with, together with the Reverend Bevel, the issue of the Pike statue. Either if the statute called Morals and Dogma, which by many members of the Scottish Rite in the United States is considered a virtual Bible, or at least the anti-Bible of that section of Freemasonry. And that book, Morals and Dogma, is a book consistent with the satanic religious beliefs explicitly adopted and advocated by General Pike. General Pike, of course, was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. That is not disputable on the basis of the evidence in hand, though Mr. Kleinknecht proposes to dispute it. What I wish to do here at this moment is to identify the nature of the core or characteristic issue at stake between me and the fellow who has engaged me publicly for this debate, Sovereign Supreme Commander C. Fred Kleinknecht. As the letters of Albert Pike to Giuseppe Mazzini illustrate the point, Pike, like Mazzini, was a Satanist, and like Mazzini, was an instrument of a circle in London headed or associated prominently with Lord Palmerston, the author of Opium Wars Against China, among his other virtues. The object of Pike's endeavor, and that of Palmerston and also Mazzini, was to destroy the United States, a continuing commitment since our War of Independence to destroy the United States, this time by means of fomenting a division of the nation between one part of the nation controlled by the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite and other parts of the nation. This conspiracy of traitors, and they were all in the leadership, conscious traitors to the United States, that is, agents acting as agents of a Britain which used them in an effort called the Civil War or the Secession to destroy the United States by dismembering it and thus making the entire Western Hemisphere virtually a colony of the British Empire. So these people were not honest rebels, they were traitors. This party of treason was born in the Tory British sympathizers of the period of the American War of Independence. And because of a treaty arrangement, these people who were traitors in effect to the United States then stayed behind in large part and formed what became the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry in its modern form within the United States. They were famous as the slave traders. They were famous as the partners of the British East India Company, i.e. Lord Palmerston's Britain, in running opium principally into China. The Lowell family, for example, which George Bundy is descended, was part of this gang of treasonously inclined opium traders. They were the Perkins Syndicate of Salem, Massachusetts, which a lot of the Massachusetts blue blood families, so-called, were derived their wealth from. And they were also part of the Russell Syndicate out of Russell and Company in Connecticut. The Russell and Company, which is the controlling interest from then, early in the 19th century, to the present day at Yale University, which gave us, of course, such things as George Bush. And these people were notorious in 1814 as having been part of the British agent Burr's conspiracy to destroy the United States. They were part of what was called the Hartford Convention of 1814, a conspiracy.
The speakers today will be, after Mr. LaRouche, will be Anton Chaikin. Mark Kalny, unfortunately, is ill and will not be here. However, his speech will be read for him by Khushro Gandhi, especially if he's here. Oh, there he is. Good timing. Mike Minicino, Jeff Steinberg, and Kathleen Klanetsky, one of the most, among them, perhaps one of the most formidable collection of people who have developed the ideas and the exposés and the information and the analysis which has driven terror into the hearts of our enemies, and I think you'll see why as a result of the presentations which they make to you today. So, without further ado, if Charles has Lynn's tape ready, I would like to begin with that.
Recently, there was a letter and accompanying document attacking me, issued by the Supreme Commander of the Southern Jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, one C. Fred Kleinknecht. The issue which the document addresses explicitly is my proposal to remove from its position on U.S. government property in Washington, D.C., the ugly statue of a traitor, a war criminal, a racist, and a satanic degenerate, General Albert Pike, who was one of the leading predecessors of Mr. Kleinknecht as Sovereign Supreme Commander of the Southern Jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Moreover, Mr. Pike, General Pike as he's sometimes called, is the author of a book